All right, Hebrews chapter 11. So I think this is week 3 on Hebrews chapter 11. The description of faith in verse 1. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for, certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. And that's what we've been looking at. That's what the writer of Hebrews has been stressing. And we've looked at Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham in various situations in Abraham's life. And we're going to start about verse 20, about the faith of Isaac. But before we do, I want to go back and just read a few verses that really bridge what he's talking about. Verse 6 of Hebrews 11. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Verse 10, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And in verse 13, all these people that he had been talking about were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted they were aliens and strangers on earth. Now, people who say such things show they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So let's go down to verse 20 and pick up. And I'm going to read probably down through verse 28 anyway. Verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. And of course that blessing was one that was turned around from what would have been anticipated, because the blessing and promise of God was passed on to Jacob. Verse 21, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. That too was another surprise blessing. A blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh. And if you remember, it was the blessing where Jacob called Israel in that passage. Jacob crossed his hands and put his right hand on Ephraim's head and his left hand on Manasseh's head. And Manasseh was the oldest. And if you remember, Joseph tried to take his hands and put them back where he thought they ought to be. And Jacob said, no, this is the way God wants it. This is the blessing that I'm called to give. Verse 22, by faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. And you remember the story of Joseph, how he really saved his family, brought them to Egypt, saved them from the famine, and things were going really, really well. And the family just expanded and grew, and the Hebrews were growing. And Joseph is talking about, as he approached his death, the fact that they're going to have to be saved from this land. There was a 400-year bondage ahead of them. And he basically said, promise you're going to take me back to the promised land, back to Canaan. Verse 23, by faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Do you remember what the king's edict was? To kill every male of the Hebrews born. Okay? And Moses' parents hid him. And then who came along and ended up taking care of Moses? Yeah, Pharaoh's daughter. And then who did Pharaoh's daughter have come and nurse and take care of Moses? His mother. How about that? Pretty cool, right? God had that under control all the way. Verse 24, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Let me go ahead and go down through verse 31. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell, after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. All right. So we've talked about in those verses Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, the faith of the people going through the Red Sea, the walls of Jericho falling, and the faith of the prostitute Rahab. I've been doing all the talking here so far. So what's grabbing your attention in the faith of these people mentioned? Do you have thoughts, questions about what we've been just read?
I love that Rahab is mentioned.
Keep going.
It touches me when God, and particularly Jesus, but when anywhere in the Bible women are pointed out, because it was so countercultural at the time.
Yeah.
And particularly Rahab, because of how she lived. She and others like her been so historically condemned by the church, but God was able to look and find favor with what was in her heart.
And there was a moment of decision for her, wasn't there? That moment of decision was, do I believe God is in this and that this is his purpose as he's coming in to the promised land and Jericho? I mean, this is her home. These are her people. She had a major decision to make there. And it was a step of faith, because if they had discovered what she did, she would have been put to death immediately. On the other hand, I guess the case could be made, if she hadn't, she would have been killed when Jericho was taken. So yeah, her faith was very evident. And you see that especially in the ministry of Jesus. He reached out where nobody would reach, for sure. What else catches your attention? Tom?
It seemed like for some of these, their faith had actually progressed to be, it was just knowledge. They just knew.
Is there any particular person that's...
Moses is what I was thinking of. When he went through the Red Sea, he didn't have any doubts about it.
How do we know
His
he
faith
did?
was real.
You know, that is an incredible story. I don't remember the exact quote about Exodus 14:14, but in essence it was God saying, you stand still because I'm going to fight for you. And what a message to me that is, even today. That there are some things so out of our control, so far beyond us, that it becomes a matter of faith and trust, standing still and letting God be God. It's kind of interesting, because when you stop and think about that, their backs were against the wall. And he was praying, and it looked like it was done. It looked like their release from bondage was very short-lived, because here comes the Egyptian army. And then as he prays, that sea opens up. And I'm thinking, if that sea opens up, I'd say, God did that. I'm out of here. And there go the people across. But it's also interesting when you stop and think, the army of Egypt had faith too, that wouldn't, that they'd get across. And came down on top of them. What else is striking you? Yes?
I guess I've always had some confusion, just don't understand why, it says verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future, when one was deceiving their father.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember us wrestling with that big time. We studied the life of Jacob, and that is an interesting time because he wasn't real happy when he was deceived. I guess and you all might want to respond to that. One thing I find is that when he found out he had been deceived, there was something. I mean, he was angry. But there was something in him. Now, it could have been anything from the concept of I've already done it, I can't undo it, to I've done it, and this is what God has wanted. And at that point, faith takes over in the sense that he was upset about it, but there's a sense of this is the one that God wanted to bless. And when I think back to that story, we had a conversation in here about, Jacob and Rachel, or Isaac and Rebekah. I'm sorry. Isaac favored Esau, and Rachel, or Rebekah, help me out here. Rebekah favored Jacob. Thank you. And from the very beginning, I mean, she prayed when the twins were jostling within her womb, God, what is going on here? And at that very moment, before the babies were even born, God said the older will serve the younger. In other words, the younger is going to be the one that receives my blessing and the one that's going to be carrying on the promise, etc. So I've got to believe, there's so much we aren't told. I've got to believe that Rebekah didn't just keep that to herself. I've got to believe they talked about that all the way through and maybe argued about it all the way through. I can hear Isaac saying to Rebekah, you misunderstood that. There's no way God said that. There's no way that's going to happen. And Rebekah saying, look, I know what I prayed, I know what I heard, and this is what God says. So, there was this struggle all those kids' lives growing up, which is a great, you talk about not parenting 101, how not to parent. That's one that strikes. But it's a very good question, that you're bringing up. But Jacob did receive the blessing, and it stayed with him. Even though, as you see, the internal struggle, it happened. Any other thought on that, or any other thing you want to bring up on any of these folks, Larry?
God says He's going to choose Jacob. I have chosen. God chooses Jacob, but does He instruct? Who's Jacob's mother now?
Jacob's mother is Rebekah. It does get confusing.
It is to me. Does He instruct Rebekah to deceive her husband?
I don't believe so at all. No, I don't believe so at all. I believe that was Rebekah taking things into her own hands.
God could have done what He was going to do without.
Absolutely. And you know what? The other thing I think about that is that marriage would have been a whole lot stronger, and that those guys might have understood. And actually, I think I remember talking like, if these two had come together and had said, okay, I confess, I'm really pulled to Esau. The dude likes to hunt. And she says, well, I confess, I'm really pulled to Jacob because he likes to be among the tents, you know. He's got, and then prayed about it together and talked together about it, and then taught the kids, hey, this is where God's coming out here. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I like so much about the story is it does have a happy ending.
Yeah, it does.
Well,
I mean, what way are you thinking about?
Esau and Jacob are reconciled.
Yes, they are.
When you next see Esau, he is no longer bitter.
Yeah.
He has a heart full of grace.
Yeah.
He is reconciled, and it's a happy ending.
And that was a shock to Jacob.
But then, weren't the Midianites Esau's descendants?
Well, we're just talking about right then and there. We're talking about two brothers right then and there who can't be held responsible for what the line down. You know, how many times do you read in Scripture, this king was godly, and along comes the son. And boom, there they go the other way. Anything else about these folks? These are great. What I hope you're doing is, as you read through this, you don't just read that verse and say, well, that's cool. I hope you're reading it, going back and reading the story in Genesis. Most of these. All of these, by the way, all the way down through Rahab, it's kind of interesting. I mentioned earlier, he's talking about all of these people, Old Testament saints who live by faith. Can you imagine how long this chapter had been if he had gone past the 6th chapter of Joshua? That's all of these folks are in the first 5 books of the Bible plus the first 6 chapters of Joshua. And then you got all these others, which he mentions in brief passing along the way. I wondered what you all were thinking about what was spoken about Moses. Anybody catch your attention with some of the things that the writer of Hebrews said about Moses, especially verses 24 through 28?
26, he suffered shame because of pride.
Yeah, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Why? Because he was looking ahead to his reward. Now that's a pretty interesting viewpoint after Christ, after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and the church already established. And if you think about it, now let me throw context back into this. We've already heard this. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. We've already heard Abraham. He was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. In verse 13, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted they were aliens and strangers on earth. They were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Now, with those thoughts in mind, contextually, verse 26, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ. Clearly, my phone used to have a ring like that. That's okay. That's okay. That was a nice ring. Clearly, Moses, he was 1,400 years before Jesus.
He must have realized that Pharaoh's daughter was not his mother. It doesn't say so, but the fact that he did not.
Yeah, I think he did understand that.
Yeah.
He clearly understood that. But he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. But I think your question and thought probably centers around disgrace for the sake of Christ. So how would you respond to that? What's the writer of Hebrews pointing to there? The Christ there, is it literally the anointed one? Okay. So what was Moses' role?
To get him in the promised land.
He was a deliverer, right? He would deliver them from bondage. He was the mediator between God and in the covenant relationship between God and the people. He was the one who brought the commandments, the ways of God to the people.
Did he understand Messiah?
Did he understand it fully?
Like he transcribed the law and all of that symbolism, but did he know what it was pointing to?
That's a question, and the writer of Hebrews gives him a whole lot of credit. Okay? How much he knew, I don't know if we can know. When I think of Moses, when I think about what they're saying here, disgrace for the sake of Christ, he knows the promise. The promise was given to Abraham 600 years earlier. That promise is dead set in their minds. He understands that completely. That all nations on earth are going to be blessed through Abraham, and the only way that was going to happen was the anointed one, the Messiah, the one who would come. Now, how he pictured that, I couldn't begin to tell you. Except when I think about him, I think about the fact that what his role was paralleled what Jesus' role was. Deliverer, saving from bondage, intermediary, intercessor. And then there's a way he really suffered. He suffered greatly. If you go back and read the life of Moses, that man had to put up with a whole lot. And eventually, and we could talk about this a long time, eventually was not allowed by God to go into the promised land. Died outside of the promised land.
No, but he got his greatest wish. He saw God face to face.
He got to be, when he died, basically, and the best way I can describe this is God took care of him in his death. Was right there. Let him see the promised land. And who can begin to imagine what that was like at the end of his life? To be with God. And the description at the end of Deuteronomy was that there has been no one like Moses since. And that his eyes were still good and his body was still strong when he died. I mean, it's just an incredible, and he was an incredible man of God. But he regarded all he went through to be of much more value, greater value, than to stay in Egypt. Some believe he would have been the next Pharaoh in line if he'd stayed. And to have all the treasures of Egypt. He gave all that up because he was looking ahead to his reward. What do you think his reward was?
Seeing the promised land and being with God.
To see the heavenly promised land, right? To be with God. Mike, were you going to say something?
Oh, I almost forgot.
Did you forget?
Me very well, do you?
Huh?
Huh? Now, I'll tell you what, I'm a straight-up guy. Am I welcome here?
Absolutely.
No, I'm not. But I'll go ahead and say it anyhow. The thing is,
Well, let me stop you right there, Mike.
faith is the substance of things hoped for. Right? Faith is the substance of things hoped
Yeah.
for. A way of understanding that is lightning. In the heavens, at times there's a great charge of electricity in the earth, in the skies, but it can't reach the earth. Do you know what it takes for that lightning to reach the earth? There has to be just a little minute bit of charge on the earth, just minuscule, that little bit of light of electricity, like this is the positive up here. When this will spark, about like your spark plug, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it ignites, that's faith. When that power, there is ignited, it releases all this is up here to come down here and ignite. But it's a substance. That's what it's referring to.
Mhm.
That the faith in us. Faith isn't wishful thinking.
Correct.
To God, it is like lightning. It has mass and energy at the same time. That he will place that little charge.
And how do you relate that to Moses?
Well, it relates to faith. Well, that's what you were referring to a while back. That by faith, the whole theme of everything is by faith.
In this whole chapter, right?
So if we don't understand, see, we say faith, but do we
live it?
realize we have to experience?
Right.
Faith is an experience, not an idea.
Right. Right.
When we experience that faith in us, and it's alive in us, and we carry that around, what I was trying to do is trying to help identify what you were saying. What you were asking, what is faith? I know that was quite a bit back in your message.
You and I need to have a talk after we're finished.
Well,
Okay? Let's do that.
that's fine with me.
Okay.
Straight up, though.
And I will be too. Okay? It's 7:15. I think we probably need to stop right at this point. So we're going to pick up with any other thoughts you have, verses 29 through 31 next week, starting at verse 32.